I never thought I'd work as a night watchman. It wasn't exactly a dream job, but it paid the bills and, in theory, seemed simple. An abandoned warehouse, with long corridors and old boxes stacked everywhere. My only task was to ensure no one broke in or stole anything. The place used to be a logistics hub, but the company went bankrupt years ago. All that was left was the skeleton of a forgotten structure, filled with dust, echoes, and now me. My shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. I've always considered myself a rational person, so I imagined the worst part would be fighting off boredom. And for a while, that's exactly what it was. Silent walks through the corridors, checking doors and padlocks, and watching the security cameras as the clock seemed to crawl. It all started in the third week. I was checking the cameras as usual when I heard footsteps. They echoed through the concrete halls. I immediately stood up, grabbed my flashlight, and went to investigate. At first, I thought it might be a rat or even the wind, but the sound was different, rhythmic, heavy, like someone was really walking. I went to the corridor where the sound seemed to be coming from, but there was nothing there, just silence and the uncomfortable sensation of being watched. I checked the doors and padlocks. Everything was in place. I went back to the monitoring room, convinced it was just my mind playing tricks on me. After all, who would want to break into such a forgotten place? The next night was worse. While making my rounds, I noticed one of the doors, which I was certain I had locked, was open. It was a small room filled with empty shelves. I inspected the area, but there was no one there. I locked the door again, trying to ignore the chill down my spine that was screaming for me to leave. Things escalated quickly. Objects I knew were in one place would appear in another. Boxes were moved. And then came the worst part, the cameras. One night, around 2 a.m., while reviewing the live feed, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing in the middle of one of the corridors. It was facing away from the camera, completely still, wearing what looked like tattered clothing. I grabbed my flashlight and ran to the spot, but when I got there, no one was there. I returned to the monitoring room, sweating and shaking, and replayed the footage. But the recording of that section was simply gone, as if it had never existed. It was impossible. I knew what I saw, but I had no way to prove it. The following nights were a nightmare. Each shift, I felt the presence getting closer. I started hearing whispers, low and indistinguishable, as if someone were speaking directly into my ear. Whenever I looked at the cameras, I felt like something was about to appear, like it knew I was watching. One early morning, during my final round, I noticed all the doors in the warehouse were open. Every single one. The padlocks hung loose, as if they had been intentionally ripped off. My gut screamed at me to run, but something inside me forced me to keep going. I began closing the doors one by one until I reached the main corridor. That's when I saw it. The figure was there, standing, staring at me. This time it was facing me. The face, I can't fully describe it. It was as if the human features were wrong, distorted, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile that seemed larger than it should be. It didn't move, but the sense of menace was overwhelming. Paralyzed with fear, I turned and ran. When I reached the monitoring room, I locked the door and stayed there until sunrise. I didn't care about the job, the recordings, or anything else. I just wanted to make it out alive. The next morning, I went to my supervisor to quit. He gave me a strange look when I explained what happened and said something that left me speechless. "You're the fourth guard to quit with the same story." Now, every time I pass by that warehouse, a shiver runs down my spine. I don't know what was watching me that night, but one thing is certain. It's still there, and it's waiting for someone to take my place. I work the night shift at a small hotel in the countryside. Nothing glamorous, but it's quiet and pays the bills. At least that's what I thought. Most nights were monotonous. Checking reservations, assisting one or two late guests, and fighting off sleep the rest of the time. But then things began to change. During the first week, it was small problems. Lights flickering in unoccupied rooms. I figured it was just the hotel's old wiring. Then came the sounds. Whispers I couldn't pinpoint, echoing through the empty hallways. At first, I thought it was guests, but whenever I checked, there was no one there. By the second week, the complaints started. Some guests began mentioning a woman in a black dress. One guest came to the front desk, pale, asking who the woman standing at the end of the third-floor hallway was. I checked the security cameras but didn't see anyone. She insisted she saw the woman clearly. Tall, thin, wearing an old black dress and a veil covering her face. She said that when she tried to approach and ask if the woman needed help, the figure simply vanished. I'll admit, at that point, I laughed it off and tried not to give it much thought. People have vivid imaginations, especially at night. But the complaints kept coming. Other guests reported seeing the same figure, always on the third floor, sometimes standing in the hallways, other times by the windows, as if she were staring outside. Then things got worse. It was around 1 a.m. when the front desk phone rang. I checked the panel to see which room the call was coming from. The display showed the number 306. My mind froze. Room 306 was empty. No one had booked that room for days. I picked up the phone, my voice trembling. Front desk. Good evening. On the other end, a raspy voice, almost a whisper, said just one sentence. Leave the hotel. Now. I hung up immediately, my heart racing. I didn't know what to think. I decided to check room 306, convincing myself it was just a glitch in the phone system or maybe a cruel prank. Grabbing the master keys, I headed upstairs. When I reached the third floor, the hallway felt colder than the rest of the hotel. Every step made the floor creak, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. When I got to room 306, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked all the unoccupied rooms. I carefully pushed the door open and shone my flashlight inside. The room was empty, just as it should have been. But something was wrong. The bed, which should have been neatly made, was messy, as if someone had been lying there. The window was open, and the curtain swayed gently. When I went to close the window, I noticed something scratched into the glass, as if done with fingernails. She is here. My entire body froze. I bolted out of the room, nearly tripping, and ran back to the front desk. The security cameras were all operational, so I decided to review the footage from the third floor. What I saw still haunts me. At 12:58 a.m., a figure appeared in the third-floor hallway. Tall, thin, wearing a black dress and a veil over her face. She didn't walk. She seemed to glide, stopping in front of room 306. At exactly 1 a.m., she turned her face toward the camera. Even though her face was veiled, it felt like she knew I was watching. And then, she disappeared. That night, I couldn't leave the hotel. I was alone, and my boss wasn't answering his phone. I stayed at the front desk until sunrise, jumping at every sound. When my shift ended, I handed in my keys and quit on the spot. To this day, I don't know what happened in that hotel. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I think about the woman in black. And I wonder if she's still there, waiting for the next night guard to warn that it's already too late to leave.